To our audience online, we need to explain something that took place last week. There was no audio, and I don't think, William, did you go ahead and put it on there anyways, in case somebody read lips? Okay. And he didn't put it online, and because of that, so this week I'm going to start by doing a brief review of where we were or what we did last week. And again, it will be a brief review and not some of the, I guess you'd say, more interesting things that we may have brought up. When we look at our text, I'm going to start by just looking at where we left off. Therefore, many of them, and we're in Acts chapter 17 and verse 12, therefore many of them believed also of honorable women, which were Greeks, and of men, not a few. Now, when they fact-checked Paul and Silas, not like the fact-checkers today that misconstrue everything to fit some kind of political agenda, they realized they had a choice to make. Just like anyone, if you are given the information and you check it out to make sure that it's right, then you have two choices to make. You can either accept it or you can deny it. And so their choice was either to accept Jesus as the Christ or to reject him. That was their choice. In essence, their choice was we either accept salvation or we reject salvation. Now, because they had honest hearts, because they were fair-minded, many of them became Christians. Consider just for a moment, it's not their faith which gave them forgiveness. It didn't give them forgiveness of their sins, nor did it add them to the church. Faith gives us the opportunity, the power to become a child of God. Jesus said in John 1, 11 and 12, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. Why? But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God. One doesn't become a son of God until he has believed the message that God sent, until he's willing to obey that message. He does not become a child of God until he is immersed for the forgiveness of his sins. Doesn't happen. So you see, faith in and of itself is worth nothing. A lot of people believe in Jesus as the Messiah, but it does them no good because they're not willing to obey the commands of God. As a result of their fair-minded attitudes, their honesty of heart, and their faithfully searching the Scriptures. What did they have? The Old Testament, not the New. They looked at all the prophecies about Jesus. They saw the fulfillment of them. And just like anyone who had that material available to them at that time, who searched it, they could easily know who the Messiah was. They could easily know that he had come. One of the things that we did last week is trace the pronouns. It's very important to trace the pronouns. Just as in Acts chapter 2, you see the first 4 verses, a lot of pronouns. Well, who do they refer to? If you were in Indonesia and I used a pronoun, you would say, who? Because their pronoun covers he, she, it, whatever. And they're very literal in their language. If you go back to Acts 2, who is it that received the ability to speak in tongues on that day? Languages that they had never studied. You have to go back to the last verse of chapter 1 and the last proper noun, apostles, and now you know who the pronouns fit. Well, the same thing is true here. And you'll see that it was Jews who were accepting, who were in the synagogue. Now, we also see a reference then to Gentiles, women of high position and men also. The passage, the verse that we think about, divided it into two groups, the Jews at first and Gentiles second. One of the things that has always interested me is you find very few high-ranking people in a community who are members of the Lord's church. Have you ever noticed that? Very few senators, congressmen, presidents. They had one who, if you'll remember, famously said that when he took the presidency, he stepped down because he had been an elder in the Lord's church. Verse 13, but when the Jews of Thessalonica had knowledge that the word of God was preached of Paul in Berea, they came thither also and stirred up the people. These old vindictive, hate-filled Jews of Thessalonica. They'd run him out of town, caused him to have to leave town quickly. They make a 100-mile journey. Not like today in an automobile and we just there. Oh no, this would have taken days for them to get down from Thessalonica to Berea. These hate-filled, vindictive Jews from the synagogue who caused him to leave Thessalonica. And we pointed out the irony of this because Saul, who became Paul, had once chased Christians from town to town, and now he's being chased from town to town. And for the same reason. As Saul of Tarsus, he chased them because they believed in Jesus. They were advocating for Jesus. They were teaching about Jesus. Now Paul is doing the same thing that he chased others down for doing in his time. And because envy played such a part in the Jews, it was for envy that they delivered Jesus to Pilate. Envy has been talked about in our context. Because it was envy, do you think maybe the reason, or at least part of the reason why they chased Paul from Thessalonica to Berea was because of the great revival that was going on there? And notice what these Jews did. They stirred up the people. The original word here refers to a shaking, like an earthquake or a tornado that just, or we might think of recently we had a real violent wind here. And if you went outside and looked at the trees, you'd see them just every which way. Well, that's the idea. They stirred. They caused them to shake. They troubled them. They agitated the people. In verse 14 and 15, and then immediately the brethren sent away Paul to go, as it were, to the sea, but Silas and Timotheus abode there still. And they that conducted Paul brought him unto Athens, and receiving a commandment unto Silas and Timotheus, or Timothy, to come to him with all speed, they departed. The quickness of their taking Paul out of that situation. Notice in Thessalonica, they waited till nightfall and then removed Paul to Berea. Here, they're removing from Berea, and the quickness of it suggests that this was a very violent reaction that was taking place. Now, notice it says, as it were to the sea. Now, again, there are a lot of different thoughts on this. Some believe it was a fainting toward the sea, but then they went by land. Some believe that they went by sea and then partially by land. Some believe they went the whole way by sea. Whatever the case is, notice they got Paul out of there. Now, note that Paul left Silas and Timothy back in Berea. And that raises a lot of questions in our mind. Could they be safely left there? I mean, Paul had to get out of there apparently very quickly, which would suggest the possibility that great violence had been used against him to drive him out of the city, to cause the brethren such earnest care to get him out of there. Why would Paul then leave them there? And the answer, I think, is the great love and care that Paul had showed toward all Christians, all people, for that matter of fact. they needed help. They'd just been introduced to the gospel. It hadn't been very long. And they needed help. And notice also that those who escorted Paul out of Berea escorted him all the way to Athens. Now that was a journey of approximately, if memory serves me correctly, and I'm not positive on this, I think about 175 miles. And then what did they do? After they got him to Athens, he gave them some instructions, particularly a commandment to tell Silas and Timothy to come to him quickly. Now, we can look at that and wonder. Some believe that they did indeed come to him quickly and that he immediately sent him to two other places, individually to two other places, and then they met him in Athens or in Corinth, rather. Or it could be that they did not make it to Athens to be with him and went to Corinth. There's a lot of speculation and thoughts on that. And again, most of it is speculation. It was the home. Why Athens? Why did Paul go to? Well, here's the cultural center where the great philosophers of their day and the great philosophers of time past had gathered and given their philosophies to the world. Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle, of course, being the greatest of those philosophers. But it was also the home of two new philosophies, so to speak, that were dominating in Paul's time. One of the instigators of that was a man named Epicurus. And Epicurus founded what is known as Epicureanism. And also Zeno. Now Zeno founded what was known as the philosophy of Stoicism. And we're going to see a little more about that in just a little bit. So why would the people of Athens be willing to at least listen to Paul? Well, we're going to notice in the text in verse 21, what did the Athenians do? Oh, and people who were strangers who came to this city. They went to Areopagus. Why did they go there? Because they wanted to hear some new thing. I want you to remember that. New thing. Some new thought. And they wanted to tell new thoughts. Hear and tell. They had been conditioned, the people in Athens had been conditioned to listen and to debate new ideas. So this would have been prime territory for Paul to be able to introduce the gospel of Christ. Because we'll see, they looked at this is something really new, this is strange. Notice the commandment to Silas and Timothy, come to him quickly. That brings us to verse 16. Now, while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. His spirit, notice that word, stirred. It was agitated. His spirit was agitated. In fact, the original word, paraxo, means stirred or provoked to anger. Notice something. Is it wrong to be angry at times? Absolutely not. Oh, didn't the Lord get angry within himself when he chased the money changers and the selling of items out of the temple? Did he sin? No. Be ye angry, Paul said in one of his other letters, and sin not. There are things you and I ought to get angry about. We ought to be angry about denominationalism, teaching their false doctrines and condemning people to hell. We ought to be angry about the homosexual community in our world promoting their horrible doctrine and treatment of children. Did you know right now in the United States, a lot of kindergartners are being taught this nonsense and this so-called gender identity? He saw a city that was filled with sin, and thus they were lost. He saw the city wholly given to idolatry. Some have written that you could not look in any direction and not see an idol in Athens, no matter where you were in the city. Jenny and I saw that in Indonesia, where the Hindu idols were everywhere. You couldn't look anywhere inside of a city without seeing these idols. You couldn't walk through the city without fear of stepping on the little offerings of food and drink that were left on the sidewalk to these false gods. So why did Paul, what did he do when his spirit was stirred within him? Now, that brings us to verse 17. Therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews and with the devout persons, and in the market daily with them that met with him. And just a side note, Jenny said that last week I must have blundered or something, not thinking, said that there was not a synagogue in Athens. Well, there was. So I apologize for that if I said that. And I think I probably did. She said I did. You know how it is, women, if they say that we did it, whether we did it or not, but we did it. Paul began his work where he always did when possible. And notice he says he disputed. De om ahi. What does it mean? To converse, to discourse with one another, to argue, to discuss. What do you do when you talk with someone about some subject, whatever it is, and there's some disagreement? Isn't there a little argument going on? I mean, the argument can go from just very bland to angry and fisticuffs, can it? I've had brethren over the years say, oh, it's so wrong to dispute. It's so wrong to debate. Folks, don't ever succumb to that nonsense. How we go about it may be wrong, but it is never wrong to debate the truth of God's will with the right attitude. Never. It's never wrong to argue for the doctrine of Jesus Christ, as long as it's done with the right attitude. Unfortunately, the attitude many times is wrong in those debates. Zojates told us that this word means to speak back and forth or alternately, to converse with reason, to present intelligent discourse. And Thayer adds another thought to this. He said it means to say thoroughly. And again, I remind you that when we talk about Strong and Thayer and Zojates, we're talking about great conservative lexicographers who define the original words for us. Besides the synagogue, where did Paul teach? Well, it was the agora. And remember, the Greek word agora is the word for marketplace. We used to have a lot of those in the United States, the town square where people gathered on Saturdays and vegetables were sold, meat was sold, other things were sold. People gathered around and just kind of talked about things that were going on, and sometimes that's where the political people would come and give their speeches and all these other things, and usually the courthouse was where trials were held. Well, the marketplace, a specific part of the marketplace, was that place in Athens, a place where anyone could hold discourse. And a lot of subjects were debated there. Elections were held, trials were held, much like the old town square in the United States. Here, Paul's audience would primarily have been Gentile. And when idols are discussed, we're often tempted to think about some heathen thing that's been carved out of rock or wood or maybe precious metals or combinations. and people bow down to them. Well, these idols were exactly that. The Jews had their idols, still do. The law of Moses, that's their idol. They put it before God. Their traditions, which Jesus said they put before God. Anything that we put in first place ahead of God is our idol. Oh, sophisticated America, we don't bow down to idols. Well, if you're not a Catholic, you don't. The Catholics bow down to statues of Mary. I've watched it with my own eyes. They bow down to statues of this so-called saint and that so-called saint. The Bible says you and I as Christians, we are all saints. We don't have to have a special election to decide, are you a saint or aren't you? Oh, and there's no requirements like they do with miracles and supposed miracles, I should say. Sophisticated America? What about the idol of sports? The idol of education? Why, I'm a doctor. I've been educated and I know far better than you. But Doc, wait a minute. I know what my body's telling me. But you don't listen. Why? You ever run into that? Oh, I'm a doctor. I know what's best for you. Science, the God of medicine, power, money. We could go on and on. Unfortunately, too many in the church also hold to one or more of these idols. And we pointed one area out last week. How many of you have ever seen somebody who took their children who were having a ball game on Wednesday night, who normally attended Wednesday night services, Bible study, but they take them to the ball game instead? That's an idol. It's been put in front of God. How many brethren, I think I told you about this in the past, I knew of a case where these 4 members of the Lord's church loved to play golf. And on Sunday morning, they went to the golf course. Well, it just so happens the golf course was right beside, or one of the fairways was right beside where the church building was across the road. So what did they do? They had it timed out with a starter to start them at a certain time so that they could get there about the time they knew the Lord's Supper was going to be given, and they hopped the fence, went over, partook of the Lord's Supper, and then they went back to their ball game. They didn't worship. They made an idol out of the Lord's Supper. Think about it. That's where we got to last week. So let's begin with verse 18 this week, and we'll go back to our normal mode of teaching. Then certain philosophers, I told you we'd get back to them, of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him. And some said, what will this babbler say? Others, he seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preacheth unto them Jesus and the resurrection. Certain philosophers. Who? The Epicureans and the Stoics. Remember we said Epicurus was the father of this Epicurean doctrine. And it advocated that matter was all a matter of chance. Matter was eternal. They also believed in some other things we're going to look at, but I want to ask you a question. Did Darwin start the tenets of evolution, what we call evolution today? No, wait a minute. Epicurus taught, again, that matter was all a matter of chance, and it was not eternal. Well, he was right in the eternal part, but matter was not a matter of chance. That's part of the doctrine of evolution, what we call evolution. Epicurus taught that pleasure is the only end in and of itself, and it's the only thing that should be sought. Does that fit anything that you hear today? What about this doctrine of if it feels good, do it? Well, I can think of a lot of things that are not wrong in and of themselves, that are wrong to do, and you probably can too. For instance, Is it wrong to, if I have an itch on my back, to, if I can get to it, scratch it? It feels awful good, you know. Now, on the other hand, sometimes it wouldn't be good to scratch that itch. If I have poison ivy and I start scratching it, what do? I just keep spreading the poison ivy further and further. If it feels good, Epicurus said, you're under obligation basically to do it, no matter what it is. He taught that they should avoid pain and agony at all cost. He denied that there was life after death. I like what Jackson, can't think of his first name. Wayne Jackson. I like something, Wayne Jackson called them polytheistic evolutionists. And that's very true. That's exactly what he taught. And then he hedged his bets a little bit. He also taught that, now, if there is a God, he didn't have any dealings with man. It's the old idea that has sprung up in, quote, modern times. Oh, God just created everything, wound it up, and let it go, and he doesn't care. What will be, will be. What about the Stoics? Zeno is the father of Stoicism. And he taught that self-mastery through austerity is the only thing that's important. It's similar in some ways to Epicureanism. But he taught if it's good and you like it and it feels good, basically, you don't do it. You don't let yourself do this thing, whatever it is. Suicide, he said, is all right. And he went further and said, in fact, it's honorable if you're a failure in whatever you've attempted to do. The Romans practiced that as well. Oh, and Saul, King Saul, didn't he practice that as well? He was about to be defeated on the battlefield, and rather than to fall into the hands of his enemies, what did he do? He committed suicide. To him, it was more honorable to do that than to allow the Philistines to take him captive. The Romans practiced it quite often. Selfish, unloving was his view of life. A pantheistic philosophy. All of these gods, and if you'll study a little bit, don't study it too much, it's not worth it. But if you'd study some of the gods of the Greeks and the Romans, they're often so filled with hatred and anger and wanting to punish human beings. He believed that fate governed everything. In other words, he would go very well with the philosophy that when you're born, you've already been appointed an eternal place to go. He would have gone very well with the religion of Islam. Islam is a fatalistic society. They believe that if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. If I strap a bomb on myself and I go into a marketplace and I trigger that bomb, if it goes off, that's what God wanted to happen and God caused it to happen. But if for some reason it doesn't go off, well then God didn't do that, so He didn't want me to die right now. Fatalism. For all intents and purposes, Zeno was an atheist. I like something that Hackett said, and I'll read it to you. He said, in Epicureanism, it was a man's sensual nature which arrayed itself against the claims of the gospel. Remember what we showed about some of the beliefs of these two men. In Stoicism, he went on to say, it was his self-righteousness and pride of intellect. What do you see all around you in America right now? Oh, I don't need anybody. I can do it myself. I don't need anybody. I'm proud. I know. Arrogance. Both Epicureanism and Stoicism are very much alive in America today, even though they may not be known by these names. Let's ask ourselves a question. Considering the doctrines that these two individuals taught and many followed, what is the product then of the philosophies of the Epicureans and Stoicism? What product? What do they produce? Epicureanism produces degeneracy. It's deteriorated in our time to extravagance. Oh man, I got a brother that bought a $180,000 Corvette. My $20,000 pickup truck will go anywhere that Corvette will go. In fact, it'll go places that Corvette can't go. What's the big deal? Oh, we got to have the biggest houses. We got to have the biggest bank accounts. You see, it's deteriorated into extravagance with degeneracy. Stoicism, what does it produce? Selfishness, suicide. It has deteriorated into pride and self-sufficiency. Why? I heard one man say, if there is a heaven, I can earn my way there. You think so? How is it then that if a person dies and is placed in a casket and you can fill the rest of that casket up with his body with pure gold, that unless a grave robber gets it, 200 years from now, it's still there? Did y'all notice that just recently they found a grave in down in South America, I can't remember the nation, that is full of gold? What about King Tut? Over 3,000 years, he's buried in that tomb. He sure didn't take that gold with him, did he? Both philosophies exalt man and his own capabilities. Now notice that some of these philosophers thought that Paul was a babbler. What's a babbler? You know, in our time, we probably think a babbler is somebody like my wife who just talks on and on and on and on and on and just never be's quiet. And notice I didn't say y'all's wives. I'll pay for that later. For those in our listening audience, my wife just said, yes, you will. A babbler. What is a babbler? It comes from the word spermologos. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's a seed picker as a crow. What do crows do? They go hopping around and grab the seed, and hopping around, grab the seed. And grab one here, grab one there, grab one anywhere that he can find one. He picks up seeds. Figuratively, the word was used among the Greeks to signify someone who was a sponger, a loafer. Specifically, someone who was a gossip or a trifler in talk. What he talked about wasn't worth commenting on. I used to have a teacher at Memphis, and every once in a while he'd say, somebody would ask him a question in class, and he'd say, some things aren't worth commenting on. That's the same idea. They said that what Paul was talking about, it wasn't worth commenting on. It was just a bunch of loose talk. It was gossip. Thayer described this as a person who was a parasite. And Zojates described them as someone who picks up and repeats trifling things. In other words, what they were saying was, Paul has gone around and he's picked this little piece of philosophy up, and from this and that little piece and this little piece, and he's put them all together and he's made up a thing, and it doesn't even make sense. They considered Paul contemptible. They considered him to be someone who could not come up with his own ideas. Now, stop before you jump to conclusions. God gave Paul his philosophy. And before you object to saying it's not a philosophy, it is a philosophy. Philosophy guides a person's life. The philosophy can be correct or it can be wrong. Christianity is indeed a philosophy, but God gave Paul that philosophy. And because God gave it, it is not contemptible. Therefore, the greatest philosophy of all time flowed from the precious lips of Paul the Apostle. And notice they said, he seems to be a setter forth of strange gods. You see, some of those people believed that Paul was telling them about some god or gods, and by the way, it is plural, gods, that they believed, both male and female gods, and it seems that maybe that's the idea they had here. And he's telling us about some gods we don't know anything about. We've never heard anything about these gods. Isn't it interesting that they referred to, in essence, Jesus as being a god, although they didn't realize it? What was Paul doing? He was preaching Jesus Christ. He was preaching the death of Jesus, which repelled the Jews. How could our king be someone who died? And he was preaching the resurrection. I can just put myself in their place. If I had been taught all my life about all of this pantheon of gods that were all over the city, and you didn't want to insult one of them, so you gave homage to all of them, to hear about a God who was here as a human being, put on the fleshly robes of man, and then he died, and lowly old men put him to death, and then he came from the grave? This would indeed have been strange. Look at verse 19 and 20. And they took him and brought him unto Areopagus, saying, May we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is? For thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. We would know, therefore, what these things mean. Another name that we use for Areopagus is Mars Hill. We're talking about the same place, whether we say the word Areopagus, and by the way, we don't say it the right way. I'll show you that in just a few minutes. It was on the north side of Areopagus, on a raised portion of the hill, in particular where they took him. This was a place where the philosophers would gather and the legislators would gather. They would vote there, all of these things, and it was away from the noise and the distractions that would be going on in the marketplace itself. The word Areopagus is an interesting word. I told you I'd tell you how it's pronounced as best as a Westerner can pronounce it. Areos, Pagos. That's how it's actually pronounced. It meant hill of Ares, A-R-E-S, for those of you who are taking notes. It meant the hill of Ares. Now, Ares was the Greek god of war. The Roman equivalent of that was Mars. Thus, Mars Hill. Note that Paul was asked about his doctrine. I hear people today say, and unfortunately even some who call themselves members of the Lord's church, oh, we're not supposed to teach doctrine. As if doctrine is some dirty word, some nasty four-letter word that, nobody in polite society would use that term. I guess that shows us what kind of society we have in America, doesn't it? Unlike some today, Paul wasn't going to deny that he was teaching them a doctrine. If the doctrine is of Christ, it would be evil to avoid teaching doctrine, because doctrine basically really is just teaching what one believes, what is fact. The doctrine of Jesus Christ is fact. It came from God. And it can never be wrong to proclaim the doctrine of Christ. In order for doctrine to be understood, it has to be proclaimed clearly. You ever heard some preacher get up and he preaches, and when he gets done, you think, what in the world did he say? All you got to do is turn on the television. Don't watch it too much. It rots your brain. All you got to do is turn on the television, and some of these guys go in circles so much you don't know what they said. I remember one of our teachers, I think very fondly of him. And Charles, you probably had some of your teachers who were taught by my teachers say the same thing. Put it down where the calves can get it, and the cows will get it too. How very true. Of course, some people today would probably say, you're calling us cows? No. I'm illustrating. If it's down low enough that a calf can eat it, that cow, that mama, can eat it too, because she can stretch her neck down there and get it too. And if the cows or the calves can understand it in our congregations, the cows can too. Now bring us certain strange things to our ears. Oh, can't you just imagine? Again, one who died to become a king? He wasn't a king, but when he died, he became a king. A resurrection of one who was crucified, not just put to death, but crucified. To the Roman mind, to the mind of these Corinthians, that was the most humiliating and disgusting death that anyone could ever go through. A kingdom? You're teaching about a kingdom that's not a physical kingdom? Doesn't have a king like Caesar? And an eternal kingdom? One that's never ending. Why? We look around us and we know that kingdoms end, nations end. And then look at the next phrase. All the Athenians and strangers, which spent their time in nothing else, where? In Athens, but either to tell or to hear some new thing. These are those who spent their time in the marketplace, in specifically the Areos, listening to new things, discussing them, deciding whether they wanted to follow them or not, or whether they thought they were foolish or wise. You see, they're a lot like Americans today. In America nowadays, new things are best. New things are best. That's why when we get home from work, we lock ourselves in our house. We don't go outside. We don't see our neighbors. We don't talk to our neighbors anymore. Wait a minute, the old way that I remember very clearly is everybody went visiting after they got through with work and supper. New things aren't necessarily the best, but they had the idea, we got to hear new things. And many today have the same concept. You give us something new, or we'll go somewhere else and find something new. Isn't that what the denominational world does with all of their gimmicks? And I guarantee you, they stop doing the gimmicks and the people will start walking. I wish they'd stop doing their gimmicks, don't you? In religion, only the good thing, whether it is old doctrine or the New Testament, only it is good. You remember on one occasion Jesus was called Good Master? Do you remember what he said? There's none good but one. So why do you call me Good Master? And yet it was God who was speaking those words. Only God and His doctrine, whether you call it new or old, by your perspective, only it can lead to salvation. And all other doctrine, other than what Jesus brought from His Father, which was related to the Holy Spirit, which related to the apostles and other inspired writers, and which you and I can hold in our hands today, only it is good. And all other doctrine, whether it's deemed new or old, is the candy that leads to truth decay. That's it. Where's the wise? Where's the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For after that in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. We might add the preaching of the gospel. For the Jews require a sign. And the Greeks, they seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified. Unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. But unto them which are called, both Jew and Greek, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Americans are very, very much like the Athenians that Paul met in Athens. We appreciate, I want to add one little thing there, in saying that Americans today are much like the Athenians. What do? So many people today, you always see them with their cell phone, and you got to lay it down beside them. And if it pings, what's new? Americans are the same way. Follow the news cycle. Well, after a day or two, that's old news. What can we find that's new? Where's the new cycle? Americans quickly tire of what's new and want something else that's new. Thank you for your attention. You've been very kind. And we'll come back with verse 22 next week.